In the shadow of one of Britain's most prestigious boarding schools, a moment occurred that would echo through generations and challenge the very foundations of aristocratic tradition. What happened on that crisp autumn afternoon in 1953 wasn't recorded in any official school records, wasn't photographed by the press, and wasn't spoken about in polite society. Yet one man witnessed it all, a school groundskeeper whose weathered hands had seen decades of privilege and protocol, but never anything quite like this. The woman who would later become the mother of the world's most beloved princess had just done something unthinkable. Something that would ripple through time and influence how a future people's princess would view the world. This is the untold story of Frances Shankidd's moment of rebellion. A single act of defiance that revealed the courage running through the bloodline that would one day captivate the world. What you're about to discover changes everything you thought you knew about where Diana's compassion truly began. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Frances Roche's polished school shoes as she made her way across the immaculate grounds of Westheath School for Girls. At 17, she carried herself with the practiced grace expected of a young woman from one of England's most distinguished families. Her father, the 4th Baron Fermoy, had ensured that every step she took, every word she spoke, and every breath she drew reflected the weight of centuries of noble breeding. The year was 1953, and the world seemed perfectly ordered for those fortunate enough to be born into the right families. Queen Elizabeth II had just been crowned, Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, and the British Empire, though showing cracks, still commanded respect across the globe. For Frances, life moved in predictable patterns of lessons, tea, chapel, and the endless preparation for her eventual role as a suitable wife to an equally suitable husband. But on this particular October morning, something felt different in the crisp air. Frances had woken before dawn, not from her usual nightmares about disappointing her parents, but from a dream that felt more like a premonition. In it, she was running, not the ladylike trot deemed appropriate for young women of her station, but truly running, with her hair flowing behind her and her heart pumping with wild abandon. The dream lingered as she dressed in the regulation navy blue uniform, each button fastened with military precision. Her roommate Penelope Ashworth, daughter of a prominent banker, chattered excitedly about the upcoming autumn sports day. For most of the girls at Westheath, sports day meant polite applause, careful attention to posture while seated in the stands, and perhaps participating in the genteel activities deemed suitable for future wives of important men, tennis perhaps, or equestrian events where proper form mattered more than speed. Frances barely listened as Penelope described the elaborate preparations her mother was making for the event. Mrs. Ashworth would arrive in a Rolls-Royce, wearing her finest hat and pearls, ready to beam proudly as her daughter participated in the school's carefully choreographed display of refined athleticism. It was theater, really, Frances thought to herself. Everything they did was theater, performed for an audience of parents and society figures who valued appearance above all else. The morning lessons passed in their usual blur of French literature, proper etiquette, and needlework. Frances found herself staring out the tall windows, watching the groundskeeping staff prepare the athletic fields. Among them was an elderly man named Thomas Whitmore, whose weathered face and gentle manner had always intrigued her. Unlike the stern teachers and formal staff members who maintained careful distance from the students, Thomas occasionally offered a knowing smile or a tip of his cap when he encountered the girls during their supervised walks around the grounds. Thomas had worked at Westheath for over 30 years, arriving as a young man fresh from the trenches of World War I. He had seen generations of young women pass through these halls, watched them transform from spirited girls into proper ladies, their natural exuberance gradually molded into acceptable forms of expression. He understood perhaps better than anyone the invisible chains that bound these privileged daughters. During lunch, Frances picked at her meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, her mind elsewhere. The other girls gossiped about weekend plans and eligible young men they hoped to encounter at upcoming social events. Their conversations felt hollow to Frances, like echoes in an empty cathedral. She found herself thinking about her younger siblings at home, particularly her brother Edmund, who was allowed to run and shout and explore the world with a freedom she could barely remember experiencing. The afternoon brought preparation for sports day, which was scheduled for the following week. The girls were assigned to various events based on what their parents deemed appropriate. Frances had been registered for tennis and the poetry recitation competition. Safe, refined activities that would showcase her accomplishments without causing any unseemly displays of competitive spirit. As the group moved toward the athletic facilities for a practice session, Frances noticed a cluster of girls from the nearby village school passing by the gates. These were the daughters of shopkeepers, farmers, and tradesmen, whose own school held its sports day on the same grounds through a long-standing arrangement with West Heath. The contrast was striking. Where the West Heath girls moved in careful formation, their voices modulated, and their posture perfect, the village girls laughed loudly and walked with natural, unguarded movements. Among the village girls was a young woman about Frances's age named Margaret Thornley. Her father owned the local bakery and her hands bore the calluses of honest work. But what caught Frances's attention was the way Margaret moved, with purpose and energy, as if she inhabited her own body completely rather than treating it as a carefully maintained display piece. The practice session began with the usual refinements. The tennis instructor, Miss Harrington, demonstrated the proper way to hold a racket, the correct angle for a serve, and the importance of maintaining composure even during intense rallies. Frances dutifully followed the instructions, but her eyes kept drifting to the adjacent field where the village girls were practicing for their own events. There Margaret Thornley was running. Not the careful measured pace deemed appropriate for young ladies, but a full sprint that seemed to express pure joy in movement. Her hair had escaped its pins, her cheeks were flushed with exertion, and her laughter carried across the distance between the two groups. Frances felt something stir inside her, a longing so fierce it almost took her breath away. That evening, as the other girls settled into their dormitory for quiet study time, Frances found herself unable to concentrate on her assigned reading. The book of poetry that usually provided comfort felt lifeless in her hands. Instead, she found herself remembering summers from her early childhood. Before the weight of expectation had settled fully upon her shoulders, she recalled racing through the gardens at Park House with Edmund, their governess calling after them to mind their clothes and behavior. Those moments of pure freedom seemed like glimpses of another life now, memories from someone else's story. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather and with it an announcement that would change everything. Miss Harrington approached Frances during breakfast with news that one of the village girls had fallen ill and would be unable to compete in the cross-country race. The event, considered too strenuous for the refined West Heath students, had been designated exclusively for the local school girls. However, due to the partnership between the schools and the desire to maintain the scheduled events, Miss Harrington explained that they needed a volunteer from West Heath to fill the gap. The race would be run late in the afternoon after the other competitions had concluded and most of the parents and dignitaries had departed. It would be, Miss Harrington emphasized, merely a formality to complete the day's program. Frances felt her heart skip a beat. "I'll do it," she heard herself saying before her rational mind could intervene. Miss Harrington looked surprised. "Frances, dear, are you certain? It's quite different from tennis. There will be no audience to speak of, and frankly, it's rather more vigorous than what we usually ask of our girls." The word vigorous hung in the air like a challenge. Frances nodded, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "Yes, Miss Harrington, I'm quite certain." Word of Frances's decision spread through the school like wildfire. Some girls seemed shocked that someone of her standing would volunteer for such an undignified event. Others were quietly envious, perhaps sensing something in Frances's choice that spoke to their own buried desires for authenticity and freedom. Penelope was particularly distressed. "Frances, whatever will people think? Your parents will be mortified if they hear about this. Ladies simply don't engage in such displays." But Frances had made her decision, and with each passing hour, her resolve only strengthened. That afternoon, as she prepared for the race, she felt more alive than she had in years. She had managed to borrow appropriate running attire from the school's limited athletic supplies, and as she changed from her usual refined clothing into the simple shorts and shirt, she felt as though she was shedding more than just fabric. Thomas Whitmore was preparing the finish line when he noticed Frances stretching near the starting area. His experienced eyes took in her nervous excitement, the way she tested her muscles and breathing like someone preparing for something far more significant than a simple race. He had seen that look before, in the faces of young soldiers preparing for their first battle. Not fear, exactly, but the recognition that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no easy return. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the school grounds, Frances stood at the starting line alongside 5 village girls, including Margaret Thornley. The formal competitions had ended, the dignitaries had departed in their carriages and motor cars, and only a handful of teachers and groundskeepers remained to witness this final event. Frances looked around at her competitors, girls whose lives were so different from her own, who worked in shops and farms, who would never attend finishing school or make their debuts in London society. Yet standing there in the fading light, she felt more connected to them than she ever had to her own classmates. The starting signal echoed across the empty grounds, and Frances began to run. For the first 100 yards, she maintained the controlled pace that years of training had ingrained in her. But as the group rounded the first bend and moved away from the watchful eyes of the school buildings, something inside her broke free. Her legs found a rhythm she had forgotten she possessed. Her breathing deepened and synchronized with her footfalls. The carefully constructed walls of propriety and expectation that had shaped every moment of her 17 years began to crumble with each stride. This wasn't the polite athleticism of tennis or riding. This was something primal and honest and completely her own. Margaret Thornley was running beside her, and Frances caught her eye. Instead of the polite nod expected between young women of different classes, Margaret grinned, a wide, genuine expression of shared joy in the simple act of movement. Frances found herself grinning back, and for a moment all the artificial barriers between them dissolved. The course wound through a wooded area behind the school, away from any remaining observers except for Thomas, who was positioned at a checkpoint to ensure the runner's safety. As Frances passed him, he saw something in her face that took him back 35 years to his own moment of transformation in the muddy trenches of France. It was the look of someone discovering who they truly were beneath the layers of who they were supposed to be. By the time Frances emerged from the woods for the final stretch to the finish line, she was no longer running for the race. She was running towards something she couldn't yet name but knew she desperately needed. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her face was flushed with exertion, and her carefully maintained composure had been replaced by something raw and authentic and beautiful. As she approached the final turn, Frances could see the finish line ahead, but more importantly, she could feel something fundamental shifting inside her, a recognition that she was capable of more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The girl who had started this race was not the same person who would finish it. The sun was setting behind the school buildings, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and Frances Roche was about to cross more than just a finish line. She was about to take the first step on a journey that would eventually lead to her raising a daughter who would challenge royal protocol, champion the forgotten and marginalized, and show the world that compassion and authenticity were more valuable than any title or crown. But first she had to finish this race. And as her feet pounded against the earth in the growing twilight, Frances finally understood what it meant to be truly alive. The finish line appeared before Frances like a gateway between worlds. As her feet carried her across that simple white chalk line painted on the grass, she felt the earth beneath her shoes, the wind in her loosened hair, and something indefinable shifting in her chest. She had not won the race. Margaret Thornley had crossed first, followed by 2 other village girls. But Frances had achieved something far more significant. She had found herself. Thomas Whitmore stood near the finish area with his pocket watch, recording times with the same meticulous care he brought to all his duties. But his weathered face showed something more than professional attention. In his 30 years at West Heath, he had never seen one of the aristocratic young ladies run with such abandon. Most approached their assigned activities with careful calculation, always mindful of appearances and proper form. Frances had run like someone breaking free from invisible chains. As the runners caught their breath, gathering in the fading light of early evening, Frances felt the familiar world of West Heath reasserting itself around her. The school buildings loomed with their windows glowing yellow in the dusk, and she could hear the distant sounds of evening preparations. Dinner bells, conversations, the ordered routine that governed every aspect of life within these walls.
Margaret Thornley approached her with a genuine smile, her own breathing still heavy from the run.
"You've got real speed," she said simply, with none of the formal distance that usually characterized interactions between the 2 groups of girls. "Have you been running long?" The question caught Frances off guard. Running had never been something she did. It was something that happened spontaneously, in stolen moments between supervised activities, in dreams, in the wild freedom of early childhood before expectations had narrowed her world to a carefully prescribed set of acceptable behaviors.
Not really, Frances admitted, surprised by how natural it felt to speak honestly.
"This was my first real race." Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly.
"Well, you're a natural then. My brothers would be impressed. They think girls from the big school don't know how to move properly." She paused, studying Frances with curious eyes. They might be wrong about that. As the other village girls gathered their belongings and prepared to return to their own lives, Frances felt a strange reluctance to see them go. These girls, with their calloused hands and unguarded laughter, represented something she was only beginning to understand she had been missing. They inhabited their own bodies without apology, spoke their minds without calculation, and moved through the world with a directness that seemed almost foreign to someone raised in the careful and direction of aristocratic society. Thomas approached the group with clipboards and official forms, the mundane paperwork that followed even the most informal school events. As he recorded final times and checked off participation requirements, his eyes met Frances's with a look of understanding that surprised her. There was no judgment in his gaze, no disapproval of her disheveled appearance or unconventional choice. Instead, she saw something like recognition. As if he understood exactly what had just occurred. "Miss Roche," he said quietly as the other girls dispersed. "That was quite a run. I've been watching races here for 3 decades, and I can always tell when someone discovers something important about themselves." His words carried a weight that made Frances pause. Here was a man whose opinion carried no social significance, whose approval would never advance her position in society or please her parents, yet somehow his recognition meant more to her than any praise she had ever received for her achievements in more acceptable pursuits. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, and for the first time in years, she felt no need to calculate the appropriateness of her response or worry about how her words might be interpreted. The honesty felt strange and liberating. As Frances made her way back toward the main school building, she was acutely aware of how different she felt. Her muscles carried the pleasant fatigue of real exertion. Her skin was warm with effort, rather than the pale coolness considered ideal for young ladies, and her mind felt clearer than it had in months. The carefully constructed persona she had spent years perfecting seemed suddenly fragile, like a costume she could choose to wear or discard. The evening routine at West Heath unfolded with its usual precision. Dinner was served in the formal dining hall, with students seated according to year and social standing, conversations maintained at appropriate volume levels, and every aspect of behavior monitored by watchful faculty members. Frances took her assigned place at the table designated for senior girls of distinguished families, but found herself struggling to engage with the familiar topics of conversation. Penelope chattered excitedly about a letter she had received from her older sister, who was making preparations for her presentation at court. The ritual of being formally introduced to society represented the culmination of everything West Heath sought to prepare its students for. The moment when years of careful training in deportment, conversation, and proper behavior would be showcased before the most important figures in British society. "Mother says the dress requirements have become even more specific," Penelope explained, consulting a letter written on expensive stationery in her sister's precise handwriting. "The court trains must be exactly 3 1/4 yards long, and the feathers must be positioned at precisely the correct angle. One girl last season was turned away for having her plumes mounted incorrectly." The other girls at the table listened with rapt attention, asking detailed questions about fabrics and jewelry, and the complex protocol surrounding the presentation ceremony. Frances found herself nodding at appropriate moments, making the expected responses but feeling increasingly disconnected from the conversation. The elaborate rituals that had once seemed important now felt like elaborate theater, performed for an audience that valued form over substance. After dinner, the students were expected to spend an hour in guided study before evening chapel and then lights out. Frances sat in the library with her assigned reading, a collection of essays on proper household management written by the wife of a prominent member of Parliament. The text outlined the responsibilities of well-bred women in maintaining suitable homes for their husbands, managing domestic staff with firm but fair discipline, and organizing social events that would advance their families' positions in society. The words seemed to blur together on the page as Frances found her mind wandering back to the afternoon's race. She could still feel the memory of movement in her muscles, the rhythm of her feet against the earth, the sensation of pushing herself beyond the careful limitations that had defined her life for so long. The contrast between that feeling of authentic engagement and the prescribed activities that filled her days felt suddenly stark. That night, as the other girls settled into their dormitory beds and engaged in the whispered conversations that were tolerated as long as they remained brief and quiet, Frances lay awake staring at the ceiling. Through the tall window she could see the grounds where she had run earlier, now silvered by moonlight and empty of activity. The memory of the race seemed already to belong to a different person, someone braver and more honest than the Frances who now lay surrounded by the familiar comforts of privilege and expectation. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that were vivid and strange. Frances saw herself in a grand house, but instead of presiding over formal dinner parties and managing servants, she was kneeling beside hospital beds, holding the hands of patients who had no one else to comfort them. She saw herself walking through slums and speaking with people whose lives had never touched the carefully maintained world of aristocratic society. In the dreams, her hands were not soft and unblemished but bore the marks of useful work, and her eyes held a depth of understanding that came from genuine experience rather than sheltered observation. The following morning brought a return to routine that felt more constraining than ever. Frances dressed in her regulation uniform, attended chapel services, and sat through morning lessons on French grammar and proper correspondence. But underneath the familiar activities, something had changed. The race had awakened a part of herself that she could no longer ignore, a recognition that there were ways of being in the world that she had never been taught to consider. During the afternoon break, Frances found herself walking toward the gardens at the edge of the school grounds. It was here that Thomas Whitmore often worked, tending the flower beds and maintaining the carefully manicured landscape that provided an appropriately beautiful backdrop for the school's educational mission. She told herself she was simply taking advantage of the fresh air and exercise that were considered beneficial for young women's health. But she knew she was hoping for another encounter with the man whose quiet recognition had meant so much to her. She found him transplanting late-season flowers, his experienced hands working with the kind of efficiency that came from decades of practice. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile that held no trace of the deference usually shown to students by the school staff. "Miss Roche," he said simply, continuing his work as he spoke, "how are you feeling after yesterday's adventure?" The word adventure struck her as exactly right, though she couldn't have explained why. "Different," she admitted, surprised once again by how easily honesty came when speaking with him. Thomas nodded, as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. That's usually what happens when someone does something real for the first time in a long while. The world looks a bit different afterward. Frances found herself studying his face, wondering what experiences had given him such insight into the complicated feelings she was struggling to understand. "Mr. Whitmore, may I ask you something?" "Of course, miss." "Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life? Like everything you did was based on what other people expected rather than what you actually wanted?" Thomas paused in his work, his hands stilling as he considered her question. When he looked up, his eyes held a depth of understanding that made Frances feel seen in a way she rarely experienced. "I spent 4 years in France during the war," he said quietly. "When I came back, everyone expected me to be the same person I'd been when I left. My family, my friends, the girl I'd planned to marry, they all wanted me to pick up exactly where I'd left off, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, miss. I'd seen things and done things that made it impossible to pretend the old life still fit." This was the most personal conversation she had ever had with any adult. The first time someone had spoken to her about the complexity of becoming rather than simply the importance of conforming. "What did you do?" she asked. "I disappointed a lot of people," Thomas replied with a rueful smile. "I called off my engagement, left my family's business, and took this job here. It wasn't what anyone expected of me, but it was honest work that let me be who I'd become rather than who I was supposed to be."
As Frances walked back toward the school building that afternoon, Thomas's words echoed in her mind.
The idea that disappointing others might sometimes be necessary for being true to oneself was radical in a world where her entire education had focused on meeting expectations and maintaining appearances. Yet something in his quiet dignity suggested that the cost of authenticity, while significant, was less damaging than the cost of perpetual performance. That evening, as she sat through another formal dinner and participated in the expected conversations about social events and suitable marriages, Frances found herself observing her classmates with new eyes. She wondered how many of them felt the same sense of disconnection she was experiencing. How many might harbor secret longings for lives that looked different from the carefully prescribed path they were all expected to follow. The question would haunt her thoughts for weeks to come, eventually leading to choices that would reshape not only her own life, but the way she would raise her children. The woman who would one day encourage her youngest daughter to work with AIDS patients and walk through minefields would trace her understanding of authentic compassion back to a single afternoon when she chose to run with girls whose lives were so different from her own. But first, she had to navigate the immediate consequences of her moment of freedom, and those consequences were about to arrive in a way that would test everything she had learned about courage and authenticity. 3 days after the race, Frances received a message that would change the trajectory of her entire future. Miss Crawford, the headmistress of West Heath, requested her presence in the administrative office immediately following morning chapel. The formal tone of the summons sent ripples of anxiety through the student body, as such meetings typically indicated either exceptional academic recognition or serious disciplinary action. Frances walked through the corridors of West Heath with measured steps, her mind racing despite her outwardly calm appearance. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating portraits of distinguished alumnae whose carefully composed faces seemed to watch her passage with silent judgment. These women had all followed the expected path, suitable marriages, appropriate children, lives that reflected well on the institution that had shaped them. Frances wondered if any of them had ever felt the wild freedom she had experienced 3 days earlier, or if they had successfully buried such impulses beneath layers of proper breeding and social expectation. The administrative office occupied the most formal wing of the school, with heavy oak doors, Persian carpets, and furniture that spoke of tradition and authority. Miss Crawford sat behind an imposing desk that had been donated by the family of a former student who had married into the royal household. Everything about the room was designed to remind visitors of the weight of history and the importance of maintaining standards that had been carefully established over generations. Miss Crawford was a woman in her 50s who had dedicated her life to the education of young women from prominent families. She possessed the kind of understated elegance that came from a lifetime of moving in the highest circles of British society, and her reputation for discretion and judgment had made West Heath the preferred choice for parents who wanted their daughters prepared for lives of significance and responsibility. "Frances," she began, her voice carrying the neutral tone that experienced educators used when delivering news of uncertain import, "I've received a telephone call from your mother. It seems that word of your participation in last week's cross-country race has reached certain members of London society." Frances felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression carefully composed. The network of connections that bound aristocratic families together was more efficient than any formal communication system, and news of unconventional behavior traveled with remarkable speed through drawing rooms and social clubs. Miss Crawford continued, studying Frances with eyes that missed nothing. "Lady Fermoy is naturally concerned about the impression such activities might create. She has asked me to ensure that you understand the importance of maintaining appropriate dignity in all your endeavors here at school." The words hung in the air, like a formal charge in a court of law. Frances understood that she was being offered an opportunity to express regret, to assure the headmistress that the race had been an aberration that would not be repeated, and to return to the carefully prescribed activities that would prepare her for her eventual role in society. Instead, she found herself thinking about Thomas Whitmore's weathered hands transplanting flowers in the school garden, about his quiet dignity as he spoke of disappointing people in order to remain true to himself. She thought about Margaret Thornley's genuine smile as they had run side by side, about the feeling of her own muscles working in harmony with her will rather than in careful opposition to it. "Miss Crawford," Frances said quietly, "may I ask what specifically concerns my mother about the race?" The headmistress raised an eyebrow slightly, perhaps surprised by the question rather than the expected apology. "I believe her concerns center on the appropriateness of such vigorous physical activity for a young woman of your standing, and the potential for misunderstanding about your character and breeding." Frances nodded slowly, understanding the subtext perfectly. In a world where women's value was largely determined by their ability to attract suitable husbands and maintain appropriate households, any behavior that suggested independence or disregard for established norms could be damaging to carefully constructed reputations. "I understand my mother's concerns," Frances replied, choosing her words with care, "but I'm not certain that I share them entirely." The statement was quietly revolutionary in the context of West Heath's carefully maintained hierarchy, where students were expected to defer to parental wisdom in all matters of significance. Miss Crawford leaned back in her chair, studying Frances with increased attention. "That is an interesting perspective, Frances. Would you care to elaborate?" Frances felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next words would determine not only her immediate future at school, but potentially the entire direction of her life. The safe response would be to express gratitude for her mother's guidance, and assure the headmistress of her commitment to appropriate behavior. The honest response would require a kind of courage she was only beginning to understand she possessed. "I've been thinking about what it means to prepare for adult life," Frances said slowly, "and I wonder sometimes whether we're learning to be ourselves or learning to be what others expect us to be." The question hung in the air between them, and Frances could see Miss Crawford processing its implications. Here was a young woman who had been raised in one of England's most distinguished families, educated according to the highest standards and prepared for a life of privilege and influence, yet she was questioning the fundamental assumptions that underlay everything West Heath represented. Miss Crawford was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled before her as she considered her response. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a complexity that Frances had never heard from her before. "Frances, I have been educating young women like you for over 20 years. I have seen them marry well, raise accomplished children, and contribute to society in ways that bring credit to their families and their education. The preparation we provide here has served countless young women very well indeed." She paused, and Frances detected something like uncertainty in her usually confident demeanor. "However," Miss Crawford continued, I have also occasionally wondered whether our emphasis on propriety and conformity might sometimes come at the expense of developing the kind of genuine character that allows young women to meet unexpected challenges with wisdom and strength. The admission was startling in its honesty. Frances realized that she was witnessing something rare, an adult who was willing to question established practices rather than defend them reflexively. "The race you ran," Miss Crawford said quietly, "has become something of a topic of conversation among the faculty. Some of my colleagues were, frankly, scandalized. Others were intrigued by the reports of your enthusiasm, and Mr. Whitmore in particular spoke very highly of your performance."
Frances felt a flush of surprise and gratitude. She had not expected Thomas's opinion to carry weight in the formal deliberations of the school administration. Yet somehow, his quiet authority had influenced even this conversation.
"I find myself wondering," Miss Crawford continued, "whether we might be doing our students a disservice by discouraging all forms of authentic engagement in favor of careful performance of expected roles." The statement was revolutionary, coming from the headmistress of an institution dedicated to preserving traditional values and preparing young women for conventional lives of privilege. Frances understood that she was witnessing a moment of genuine uncertainty from someone who rarely revealed doubt about anything. "What would you suggest?" Frances asked, hardly believing she was engaging in such a conversation with the formidable Miss Crawford. The headmistress smiled slightly, and for the first time in their acquaintance, Frances saw not just authority and dignity, but genuine warmth in her expression. "With your mother's permission, which I believe I can obtain through careful explanation, I would like you to continue training with the village girls for their upcoming regional competitions. Not as a representative of West Heath, you understand, but as an individual pursuit that might contribute to your overall development."
Frances felt her heart skip several beats. The idea that Miss Crawford would not only tolerate but actually encourage her continued running seemed almost too good to be true.
"However," the headmistress continued, "I would expect you to maintain your excellence in all other areas of study, and to think seriously about what you learn from this experience. I'm particularly interested in your observations about how physical challenge affects mental clarity and emotional development." Over the following weeks, Frances found herself living a double life that was both exhilarating and exhausting. Her mornings were filled with the usual round of lessons in deportment, language, and domestic management that formed the core curriculum for young women of her class. Her afternoons, however, now included regular training sessions with Margaret Thornley and several other village girls, who had accepted her into their informal running group with surprising warmth. The contrast between these two worlds was striking in ways Frances had never anticipated. In the classroom, every gesture was monitored for appropriateness. Every opinion was filtered through considerations of social acceptability, and every achievement was measured against external standards of refinement. On the running paths that wound through the countryside around West Heath, she discovered a different way of being in the world. Margaret Thornley proved to be not only a gifted athlete, but a natural teacher who understood instinctively how to help Frances develop her potential without overwhelming her with technical instruction. She taught Frances about pacing and breathing, about listening to her body's signals, and trusting her own instincts about when to push harder and when to conserve energy. More importantly, Margaret and the other village girls exposed Frances to perspectives she had never encountered in her sheltered, aristocratic upbringing. These young women worked in shops and helped their families with farming and household labor. They understood the value of money in ways Frances was only beginning to grasp, and they approached the world with a practical directness that was both refreshing and challenging. During one particularly memorable training session, as the group ran through a wooded area that bordered several working farms, they encountered an elderly man struggling to repair a broken fence that was preventing his cattle from reaching water. Without hesitation, Margaret and the other girls stopped to help, using their combined strength to lift heavy posts and secure wire sections. Frances found herself working alongside them, her hands growing dirty and her carefully maintained fingernails breaking as she helped manipulate unwieldy materials. The physical labor was harder than anything she had ever attempted, but she was struck by the immediate usefulness of their efforts and the genuine gratitude of the farmer who benefited from their assistance. As they resumed their run afterward, Frances realized that she had just experienced something entirely absent from her previous education: the satisfaction of contributing directly to solving someone else's practical problem. The elaborate charitable events that occupied much of aristocratic women's time involved raising money and organizing committees, but rarely included direct physical engagement with the problems they sought to address. That evening, As she sat through dinner at Westheath and listened to the usual conversations about social events and suitable marriages, Frances found herself thinking about the farmer's weathered hands and grateful smile. She wondered what it would be like to regularly engage with the world in ways that produced immediate, tangible benefits for people who genuinely needed help. The thoughts were dangerous in the context of her expected future, but they persisted despite her attempts to focus on the conventional concerns that should have occupied her attention. She was beginning to understand that the race had been more than just a moment of physical freedom. It had been the beginning of a fundamental shift in how she understood her place in the world. Thomas Whitmore, observing her during her regular training sessions, recognized the transformation taking place. He had seen it before in young soldiers who discovered their own capacity for courage under difficult circumstances. Frances was learning to trust herself in ways that would serve her well in the challenges that lay ahead, though she could not yet imagine how profound those challenges would become. The ripple effects of that single afternoon's decision to run would continue expanding throughout Frances's life.
The woman who learned to value authenticity over appearance, who discovered the satisfaction of direct service to others, and who understood the importance of encouraging genuine character in her children, would raise a daughter who would revolutionize the British monarchy's relationship with ordinary people. Princess Diana's instinctive compassion for AIDS patients, landmine victims, and homeless individuals would trace its roots back to these autumn afternoons when her mother learned that genuine connection required the courage to step outside the carefully maintained boundaries of privilege and propriety. The People's Princess would inherit not just aristocratic bearing, but an understanding that real nobility came from authentic engagement with the world's suffering.
But all of that lay years in the future. For now, Frances Roche was simply a 17-year-old girl learning to run with honest purpose, discovering strengths she had never been taught to recognize, and taking the first steps toward becoming the woman who would one day teach her children that authentic service mattered more than perfect performance. The guard who had witnessed it all, Thomas Whitmore, would carry the memory of her transformation for the rest of his life, understanding better than anyone else the moment when a future princess's mother first chose courage over convention. In his quiet way, he had played a role in shaping the woman who would shape the future of the British royal family, simply by recognizing and encouraging a young woman's first steps toward authenticity. The race was over, but the real journey had just begun.